The sharp buzz of the city seemed to surround her, a constant hum of voices and distant traffic. But Lena couldn't hear any of it. The world had become muffled, her heartbeat the only sound in her ears, drowning out everything else as she stood frozen in the middle of the crowded street. People passed by her like ghosts, moving quickly with their heads down, unaware of the woman who had just lost her way in the storm of her own life. It was a Sunday evening, the last hints of daylight slipping behind the skyline, leaving the city bathed in the cool, fading light of dusk. Her coat hung loosely around her shoulders, barely offering warmth, as a sharp gust of wind cut through the street. She shivered, but it wasn't the cold that made her tremble. Lena had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to maintain control even in the darkest of moments. But today, she was broken, torn apart by a betrayal that she hadn't seen coming. Victor. His name echoed in her mind like a distant drumbeat, every thought of him stirring up a new wave of anguish. He had promised her everything, only to take it all away when she needed him the most. He had said he loved her, but his actions had shown her just how hollow those words were. She had given him everything, her trust, her time, her future, and now, all of it had been reduced to ash. She could feel the burn in her chest, but there was nothing left to do but let the tears fall. It was then that he appeared. A man, taller than most, with dark hair and an effortless grace that cut through the chaos. His presence was a quiet one, yet undeniable. Marcus noticed her almost immediately, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her. He paused, his gaze lingering on Lena for a moment longer than necessary. Then, as if something deep inside him had recognized the rawness of her pain, he began to approach. "Are you all right?" His voice was calm, even, a stark contrast to the frantic energy around them. Lena's first instinct was to ignore him. She didn't want anyone's pity, least of all from a stranger. But something in his tone, gentle yet firm, compelled her to look up. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw no judgment, no curiosity, just a quiet understanding that she couldn't quite explain. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. But her words were hollow. She could feel them slipping out, empty and meaningless. Marcus hesitated, studying her face with quiet intensity. "You don't look fine," he said softly. "What happened?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to say the words out loud. But when he didn't step away, when he didn't hurry off like everyone else, she felt the dam inside her start to crack. I thought he loved me," she stammered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He said he did. But all this time, he's been using me, manipulating me." Her voice faltered. Marcus stepped closer, his brow furrowing. Who's been doing this to you?" "Victor. My boyfriend. My ex." The word felt foreign on her tongue, sharp and painful. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. He didn't press her for more details or ask for an explanation. He simply stood there, allowing the silence between them to grow, offering her the space to breathe and collect herself. Lena wasn't used to this, being given room to feel without being rushed or fixed. But something about Marcus made her feel safe, even if only for a moment. He finally spoke, his voice steady but layered with an underlying tension. "You deserve more than this. More than him." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. They were simple, but they cut through Lena's haze like a knife. The ache in her chest stirred again, deeper this time. She felt the sting of a tear escaping down her cheek, and she let it fall without trying to stop it. "I don't know how to go on," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Everything I built, it's all gone." Marcus didn't say anything for a while, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. And then, unexpectedly, he took a step forward. "You're not alone," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Lena's heart skipped a beat, the sudden closeness of him sending a shiver through her. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he meant what he said. But her walls were high, built over years of disappointment and pain. She wasn't sure she was ready to let anyone in again. But something in his eyes told her he wasn't going to give up on her. Not now. Marcus stood still, not pushing, not demanding anything from her, just offering his presence, his understanding. The wind picked up again, sharper this time, and Lena wrapped her arms tighter around herself. It was cold, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the weight of everything she just realized. How much of herself she had lost, how far she'd fallen from the woman she once was. She met Marcus's gaze again, this time not with the desperation of someone looking for answers, but with the recognition of someone who had, for a fleeting moment, found a flicker of hope. "I don't know where to go from here," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the noise of the city. "You'll find your way," Marcus replied softly. "You will." His words, though simple, carried a weight she hadn't expected. And for the first time in a long while, Lena believed them. But just as she was about to speak again, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Lena! There you are!" She froze, her blood running cold as she turned toward the sound. Victor, standing a few feet away, his eyes burning with fury and entitlement, was the man who had shattered her. He took a step forward, his presence darkening the space between them. Lena's heart sank. She had hoped she'd never have to face him again, at least not this soon. But here he was, still wielding power over her, still controlling the narrative. Marcus's hand twitched at his side, and Lena knew, in that moment, she wasn't alone anymore. This would be the moment everything changed. But how? The world had just shifted, and she had no idea which direction it would go. The air between them crackled with tension. Lena stood frozen, her body instinctively drawing tight as Victor's shadow stretched across the cold pavement. The world around her felt muted, the city's noise dimming into a dull hum as her focus narrowed to the man who had once been her everything, who had, for months, been the center of her carefully constructed world. But now, with the anger in his eyes and the arrogance in his posture, Victor was nothing more than a painful memory of betrayal. She hated him. She hated how he had made her feel small, insignificant. He was the one who had shattered her trust, yet it was as if he thought he still had a claim over her. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Victor's voice sliced through the stillness, demanding and possessive. Lena's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Not until she was sure her voice wouldn't tremble. Behind her, Marcus shifted, his presence like a sturdy rock against the storm that was about to hit. He stood motionless, his gaze never leaving Victor, his stance calm but unwavering. Lena hadn't yet understood the depths of his character, but something in the way he held himself made her feel safe in a way she hadn't known in years. Victor's eyes darted briefly toward Marcus, a flicker of recognition passing over his face before he refocused on Lena. "Who the hell is this?" he sneered, his lips curling in disdain. "Is this your new knight in shining armor? Don't make me laugh." Lena clenched her fists, her nails digging into the soft fabric of her coat. She could feel the rage bubbling up inside her, but it wasn't just anger at Victor anymore. It was the burning need to stand up for herself, to reclaim the control she had let slip away. "Victor," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "this is none of your business. I don't owe you anything anymore." The words felt foreign, like they were being spoken by someone else, someone braver than she'd ever been. Victor took a step forward, his face inches from hers. "You owe me everything, Lena. I gave you my time, my love." "Your love?" Lena cut him off sharply, taking a step back. "Don't you dare say that. Not after everything you've done. You lied to me, Victor. You manipulated me, used me for your own gain. All along, it was nothing more than a game to you." Marcus remained silent, but the weight of his quiet support hung in the air like an invisible shield, a subtle yet undeniable force. Victor's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. "You're delusional if you think I used you. I did everything for you. You're just too blinded by your own ego to see it." Lena shook her head, her eyes burning with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to break down in front of him, not now. "No, Victor. I see it perfectly. I see how you used your charm, your lies, to control everything. But I won't let you control me anymore. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Even the wind held its breath. Lena stared into Victor's eyes, her heart pounding in her chest, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had never felt more certain of anything in her life. This was the end. Victor's nostrils flared as his anger intensified. You think you can just walk away from me? You'll never be good enough without me, Lena. You're nothing without me. The words struck her like a slap. For years she had been his girlfriend, his project, his possession. He had convinced her that she needed him, that she wasn't capable of being anything without his validation. But now, in the stark clarity of the moment, Lena understood something far more important. She had been good enough all along. And she was finally strong enough to let him go. You don't get to define me anymore, Lena said, her voice calm, but firm. I'm leaving Victor. And there's nothing you can say or do to stop me. Victor opened his mouth, as if to retort, but then seemed to think better of it. He stood there for a moment, glaring at her with a mixture of fury and disbelief. But he didn't try to touch her. Didn't try to reach for her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, before he finally spoke again. Fine. He spat, his tone cold and final. Go ahead. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back to me, just like all the others. Lena's chest tightened, but she stood tall. No, I won't. And with that, she turned and began walking away, the echoes of her footsteps pounding in the quiet space between them. But before she had taken more than a few steps, Victor's voice rang out one last time. You'll never be good enough without me, Lena. Never. She didn't look back. Not even once. Marcus watched her, his expression unreadable, as she walked away from the man who had almost destroyed her. When Lena was out of earshot, he exhaled, his breath visible in the chilled air. For a moment, there was only the sound of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the low murmur of voices around them. But in that silence, Marcus finally spoke. Are you all right? Lena took a deep breath, her shoulders stiff. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she focused on the steady rhythm of her breathing, the pulse of life returning to her body. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. I will be. But even as the words left her lips, she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and Victor wasn't going to give up on her so easily. But for the first time in a long while, Lena felt like she had something more on her side than just willpower. She had Marcus, this strange, quiet man who had been a solid presence when everything around her had crumbled. They were still standing on the same street, a world of noise and chaos surrounding them, but in that moment, Lena felt the weight of the choice she had made. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in months, she felt like she might be able to breathe again. The question was, how long would that peace last? As the night closed in around them, the shadows of uncertainty began to loom once again, but this time, Lena wasn't afraid to face them. Not anymore. The city skyline was awash in the soft glow of the setting sun, casting long shadows over the streets below. Lena stood at the window of her apartment, watching the cars speed by, their headlights just beginning to flicker on. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city, but her mind was far from still. What had she done? The question circled her thoughts like an endless echo. Walking away from Victor hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Yet now, as the dust settled, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she was ready to face. Lena's gaze wandered across the room to the man sitting on her couch, Marcus. He hadn't said much since they left Victor behind, his silence a curious mix of respect and patience. She'd asked him to come with her. Not out of desperation, but because she hadn't wanted to be alone. She needed someone who would keep her grounded, someone who wasn't tangled in the web of her past. Marcus was that someone. For now. Can I get you anything? She asked, her voice breaking the stillness of the room. She hadn't meant to sound so hesitant, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. She didn't know how to talk to him, not yet. They hadn't exchanged more than a few sentences since they got here. He looked up from the book in his hands, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm fine, Lena." His voice was calm, even soothing. But there was something in his tone, a subtle shift, that told her he wasn't as unaffected as he seemed. She hadn't asked him much about his life, his reasons for being in the city, or even why he was willing to help her when they barely knew each other. But there was something in the way he carried himself, the way he moved, like he had seen his fair share of battles and come out stronger each time. Lena wasn't sure if she was ready to uncover those layers, but she knew they were there. Taking a breath, she crossed the room to the small kitchen area. Her fingers brushed over the smooth edge of the counter, a grounding motion that kept her mind from wandering too far into unfamiliar territory. She needed to focus on the present. Victor was gone. For now, at least. But she couldn't afford to let her guard down completely. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The question surprised even her. She hadn't expected to be the one asking. But something about Marcus intrigued her. She needed to know why he was so calm, so composed. Marcus set the book aside, his gaze never leaving her. "What do you want to know?" "Anything," she replied, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup absent-mindedly. "Why are you here? Why did you help me?" He took a long pause before responding, and when he did, his voice was low, almost distant. "I wasn't helping you. I was helping myself." Lena's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I've spent a long time running from things," he said, his tone slightly shifting. "I was just looking for a place to stop." Lena watched him carefully, trying to piece together the fragments of his story. He had the air of someone who had experienced deep loss, who had been weathered by time but still carried a quiet strength within him. "What are you running from?" she asked, her curiosity piqued, but there was something deeper beneath her words, something she didn't quite understand yet. Maybe it was the connection she felt, the understanding she didn't know she needed until she'd met him. He didn't answer right away, his eyes darkening slightly as though he was wrestling with a memory too painful to voice. But then he looked at her, his gaze softening. "Let's just say, I've been through things that make me see life differently than most. I don't waste time pretending anymore." Lena took in his words, each one heavier than the last. She could sense there was more, so much more, but Marcus wasn't ready to share. And she respected that. For now. She took a step back, a soft chuckle escaping her lips as the silence stretched between them. "So we're both running from something, then?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wouldn't say running. More like escaping." Lena nodded, her gaze drifting down to her hands. She had always been a runner, not just from relationships like Victor's but from the part of herself that had been taught to hide, to stay quiet, to not make waves. Now, as she sat with Marcus in this quiet room, she felt the weight of everything she had ignored for so long. "I should have known better," she said, almost to herself. "I should have seen the signs with Victor." Marcus shifted, his voice quieter now, more serious. "You can't blame yourself for someone else's choices." Her head snapped up, her eyes searching his face. "But I allowed it. I let it happen. I let him control everything." "No one controls everything," Marcus said firmly. "You gave him power, yes. But you're taking it back now. That's what matters." Lena swallowed, his words sinking deep into her chest. She hadn't heard anything like that in a long time, especially not from someone who wasn't afraid to speak truth. It was a relief, but it also terrified her. Marcus had no reason to be so open with her. Yet there he was, offering her comfort in a way no one had since her mother. The moment between them stretched out, both heavy and delicate. But as the evening darkened outside the window, Lena's phone buzzed, breaking the tension like a crack of thunder. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from an unknown number. "Victor, you can't run forever. I'll be waiting." Her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone down. The words sent a chill through her, but it wasn't fear that filled her. It was something else, something deeper, more visceral. A sense of dread, sure. But also a deep, simmering anger. Marcus noticed her reaction immediately, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" Lena met his gaze, her breath shaky. "Victor." He stood up, his expression hardening. "What did he say?" She told him, her voice low and steady now. "He said he'll be waiting." Marcus's jaw tightened, a flicker of something fierce flashing in his eyes. "Let him wait." Lena nodded. But inside, a new storm was brewing. And it wasn't just a storm from her past. It was a storm that she was ready to face. For the first time in a long time, Lena was done running. Lena sat in the dark of her apartment, the moonlight filtering through the blinds, casting slender beams across the room. The glow from the streetlights outside had shifted from amber to a harsh white, signifying the late hour. Her fingers drummed restlessly on the edge of the table, each tap echoing the unsettled rhythm of her thoughts. The text from Victor still lingered in her mind, its cold finality gnawing at her like a poison that refused to fade. "You can't run forever. I'll be waiting." She had spent years avoiding the confrontation that was now inevitable. She had let Victor control the narrative of her life for far too long. But the weight of his words, so direct, so confident, was a reminder of how dangerous he was. Of how much control he still seemed to have over her, even from a distance. Marcus was still in the kitchen, his silhouette framed by the soft light spilling from the overhead fixture. He had barely spoken since the message, but she could sense his unease. He wasn't someone who wore his emotions on his sleeve, but the tension in his posture told a different story. He had his own demons, she knew that much. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do I do now?" He paused, turning slowly to face her. There was a depth in his gaze, something that suggested he understood the weight of her question more than he was willing to admit. "You stop hiding," he said, his words low but firm. "You confront him." Her chest tightened at the idea. It wasn't the confrontation itself that terrified her. It was what Victor had made her believe for so long, that she was weak, that she couldn't stand up for herself. "And what if I fail?" she asked, almost afraid to voice the fear that had gnawed at her all night. "Then you fail," Marcus replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "But you don't let it be the end of your story. You get back up. You keep going." His words, simple yet profound, settled over her like a blanket, offering warmth in the midst of the cold storm swirling in her chest. There was something about Marcus, his raw honesty, his quiet strength, that steadied her. But the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. No matter how much Marcus believed in her, no matter how strong he made her feel in this moment, the truth was she had to face Victor alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the city outside was the only sound that filled the silence, punctuating the tension between them. "Are you sure you want to be involved in this?" Lena finally asked, breaking the silence. The question felt more like a plea for reassurance than a genuine inquiry. Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "I'm already involved, Lena. Whether I walk out that door or stay doesn't change the fact that this is happening. And I won't leave you to handle it by yourself." Lena felt a flicker of gratitude, mixed with something else, something deeper, more unsettling. The realization that she had grown dependent on Marcus in a way that was both comforting and dangerous. She hadn't meant for this connection to form so quickly. It had caught her off guard, like a sudden tide pulling her under when she thought she could stand alone. Her eyes dropped to the table, fingers trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." Her voice cracked, raw and unguarded. Marcus was at her side in an instant, his presence a quiet force that didn't overwhelm, but offered her the comfort she hadn't known she needed. "You didn't ask for it, but here you are. And I'll be damned if I let anyone take you down." Her pulse quickened at the strength in his words, at the quiet power he wielded without even trying. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't just a reflection of her pain. There was something more. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it was there, something she had been afraid to acknowledge, a connection between them that went beyond shared circumstances. Her heart gave a heavy thump against her ribs. She had spent so long keeping her emotions buried, keeping everyone at arm's length, but Marcus. He made it hard to do that. Lena swallowed, her throat dry, as she steadied herself. "I'm scared, Marcus," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice an unfamiliar weight. "I don't know if I can do this." Marcus knelt in front of her, his hands gently cupping hers, a silent offering of support. His expression softened, a rare vulnerability flickering in his eyes. "You're stronger than you think. And I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." The words, simple yet profound, struck her deeply. In the pit of her stomach, something twisted, a mixture of relief, fear, and something else that she couldn't yet name. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The phone buzzed again, breaking the moment between them. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Victor. She didn't check the message this time, knowing exactly what it would say. He wouldn't relent. He wouldn't stop until she was back in his grasp. She could feel it in her bones. The question was, would she let him win? Marcus's eyes followed her gaze to the phone, his expression unreadable, but she could see the glint of protectiveness in his eyes. "You don't have to answer it," he said quietly. "Let him wait." Lena took a deep breath and, for the first time in years, felt a flicker of defiance stir inside her. She could do this. She would do this. With a steady hand, she picked up the phone and, without reading the message, tossed it into the drawer beside her. The act felt liberating, like a door shutting on a past she was done with. "Victor doesn't control me anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. But the words felt like a vow, a declaration of her own power. Marcus stood slowly, his expression softened by approval. "No, he doesn't." And for the first time, Lena truly believed it. But as they both stood in the silence, Lena knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The real battle hadn't even started.